Me disculpa por no hablar aún la lengua de Pablo Neruda. Aún. First, I have to point out that photo. Afghanistan did this to me. I used to actually be a much more attractive man. I arrived here yesterday and went immediately to the Plaza de Boulevard. And so I have to congratulate you. What an amazing moment in Colombian history, and I'm so grateful that I could be here to witness it. This must be the happiest country on earth this week. I'd like to thank, first of all, the opportunity to speak to you on such an important subject, and thank Andy and USAID and the organizers for having me come here, because I think the issues that you are discussing here are powerful and they're important, and I'm glad I can engage you on them. I'm going to do 4 things. I'm going to tell you my story. I'm going to tell you the story of Building Markets, the social enterprise that I started. I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications for Colombia, and I'm going to tell you the 3 things that I learned over the last decade as a social entrepreneur. And then afterwards, I'll take some questions. So, to begin with, I am the son of an entrepreneur, not a social entrepreneur. And I grew up in a family where my grandfather was extremely poor. He would have to shoot moose and elk to feed his family because they had no money. And my father, who grew up in that, knew that the only way for him to be able to give a better life to his children was to go into business and become an entrepreneur himself. And I watched him as a child struggle and succeed and fail and succeed and grow his business. And I developed an appreciation for how hard it is to be an entrepreneur, but also how important and how powerful it is. So when I left university and became a diplomat, this became difficult for me, because entrepreneurs, they're over here, and diplomats are way over here. There's very little connection between the two. And when I worked on the issues of poverty in that context, entrepreneurs were never a part of any of the solutions. They were never a part of any of the discussions, and that worried me. One of my first postings as a diplomat was to Indonesia, to Jakarta. And there I became very, very aware of how powerful small and micro enterprises are in fighting poverty. Indonesia, over the course of 1 generation, went from being one of the poorest countries in the world where starvation was a regular problem to what they called an Asian tiger. And it didn't happen because of the IMF, and it didn't happen because of the big donors. It happened because of very, very small entrepreneurs, men and women who were selling a couple of things on the side of the street and then turning that into a shop, and then turning that shop into an exporter. It really was a miracle to witness. And that's about the time that my idea for starting Building Markets came about. And it was because I was such a bad diplomat. I had no skill at it. And so because of that, I was sent to East Timor, which at that time was a war-torn, very small country that was mostly forgotten. The history of East Timor is a very sad one, and unfortunately it's a very common story that we have seen in places like South America and other parts of Asia and Africa. It had been colonized by the Portuguese. The Portuguese had made almost no investment over 400 years. When the Portuguese left in 1975, they had only paved 11 kilometers of roads. And as soon as they left, because of the social tensions they had created, there was immediately a civil war. The Indonesians, therefore, invaded, and they occupied the country for 25, 30 years. They paved a lot of roads, but they killed a third of the population in the process. So the trade-off was perhaps not one that the Timorese agreed with, and they very badly wanted their independence. And when they were given the chance to have a referendum, they voted overwhelmingly in favor for independence, as most colonized countries do. And so the Indonesian army destroyed 90% of the country and left in a fit of anger. And that's when I came in with the United Nations and other agencies and found what was already one of the poorest areas of Asia now had no buildings. had no hospitals, no schools, it had nothing. And so the UN did something that they'd only done once before in Kosovo, which is they became the government. It wasn't just a peacekeeping mission, it was a nation-building mission. And bizarrely, my role in that was, I was the national security advisor. At a very young age, with no experience, with some understanding of East Timor and with the local language, but that was about it. And I was very, very bad at my job. I had millions of dollars to spend on trying to create economic security. And I worked with the World Bank and the IMF and the big donors. And collectively, our budgets were larger than the GDP of the country. And yet, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years after we arrived, the unemployment rate was still 50%. The buildings in downtown Timor were still burnt out. I was making very good money, and I was living a good lifestyle, but I wasn't succeeding in actually trying to help the Timorese, and I didn't understand why. And then I witnessed one of these miracles that I talked about before. Every day when I would walk home, well, first of all, there was no housing in Timor. Can you hear me there? There we go. There was no housing in Timor. And so I had to rent from a local Timorese man, and he had lost everything. His name was Antonio. When the Indonesians left, they had destroyed his business, they had killed his family, and they burnt his house. And all he was left with literally in the world was 4 walls. It was like the biblical story of Job. So he put a roof on those 4 walls, and he rented it to me for $500 a month. So he took my first check of $500, and he hired some local boys in the neighborhood to help him drag the burnt-out remains of a bus into the yard. And he took my next $500, and he bought some tools, and he took my next $500 rent check, and he bought an engine, and he rebuilt this bus. And very quickly, he had a bus company that was going around taking people from markets in the villages into the capital city of Dili. And by the time I left, I had still accomplished absolutely nothing in my day job with the United Nations. But my rent check had created the largest busing company in Timor. And it was this amazing island of prosperity in what was otherwise continued to be a sea of poverty. So I got into arguments at that point with the World Bank. And I said, this is insane. How is it that with all of our millions of dollars, we're having less of an impact than this one small entrepreneur? And the World Bank I should ask first, is the World Bank in the room? I always end up doing this. I always end up offending one of my donors or somebody that's in the room, and I shouldn't say these things, but in this case, it's true. The World Bank would say to me very condescendingly, it's a bad thing to spend money in the local economy. It creates what they call Dutch disease. It distorts the economy. And when the UN leaves, well, the economy is going to collapse. Now, that didn't make any sense to me on a common sense basis, but I'm not an economist, so I deferred to that. I then went to Afghanistan, which is when this happened. And in Afghanistan, I saw the exact same thing happening on a much, much larger scale. It wasn't millions of dollars, it was billions of dollars. And it was flowing through that country and making so many people wealthy, most of whom lived in Washington and Virginia. There was almost no economic recovery that was going on because of the international spending. And I had the exact same arguments with the same people in the World Bank, because like the UN and the World Bank and a lot of the donor agencies, they just moved from conflict zone to conflict zone to conflict zone. But this was too much for me to take anymore, and so I quit my job as a diplomat, and I started building markets, which is a social enterprise, a charity. And in the early days, we tried a variety of different ways to make an impact, but one of the things we did was we decided to answer this question about whether or not spending money on small entrepreneurs in peace building and peacekeeping areas created Dutch disease. Did it really hurt more than it helped? It turned out that there was no data on this. There had actually been no quantitative research done on peacekeeping missions or post-conflict economies in this case. And so we hired some of the world's best economists on this. In fact, the lead writer on this is now the chief economist for the Australian government. And we did something very, very simple that amazingly had never been done before. We went to 10 different peacekeeping missions, and we traced the money. We took a look at how much the donors had spent and where it actually went, to which programs, to which companies, to which contractors, and how many employees did they hire, how many were from the local country, how many were from overseas. And what we discovered was absolutely amazing. We found out that with the UN money anyway, that only 5%, 5 cents on the dollar, entered the local economy. The other 95%, it wasn't stolen, it wasn't wasted. What happened was it was being spent on an international company, say based in London or based in New York, who would then come in, and then they would hire some subcontractors who were based in Frankfurt or based in Mexico City or in Singapore. And then maybe down at the bottom, there might be a couple of local entrepreneurs that were engaged, but most of the goods and supplies were being flown in. So that was amazing. The second thing that was amazing was that little 5% that did enter the local economy was, in every peacekeeping mission we looked at, the single greatest driver of economic growth in all of the economies. That just that little bit of money that was almost literally falling off the back of the UN truck, that was being spent on cigarettes and on beer, on local bottled water, on local restaurants, was actually driving all the economic growth, or a majority of the economic growth. And when peacekeeping missions left, occasionally there was declines, but the economies were always better off than if they hadn't been with those investments. So based with that knowledge, we decided to run a pilot project in Afghanistan, and it was very, very simple. We wanted to see if we could redirect $10 million of procurement spending, of donor spending, into the local economy, to small and medium-sized enterprises, to entrepreneurs. And we did this by hiring about 30 local staff, and we literally walked down the streets of Kabul and found small businesses that were selling bottled water or repairing cars, and we would interview them, and we'd ask, what do you do? Do you have references? Do you have a credit rating? Do you have finance? Do you have any female employees? And in many cases, they had none of those things, but they clearly had products and knew how to do their businesses. In other cases, we discovered, even in places like Kandahar, very, very sophisticated, robust companies that were sophisticated and robust because they had been operating in a war zone for 30 years. And so they knew how to survive and how to thrive in ways that a businessman in New York or Miami would have no clue. So once we had found these businesses, we then just introduced them to procurement officers. Started with the UN, and then we moved on to the World Bank and other agencies. And we said, right now you're flying in all this bottled water from Dubai, but there's 3 bottling plants in Kabul where you could spend 1/3 the money, and they can provide you with the water. Like I said, our original goal was to do a few $1 million worth of procurement, but this concept did much more than that. It worked in Afghanistan. We moved it to Timor, to Haiti, Liberia, Mozambique, Burma. It's now opening up in Syria. And so far, it's done over $1 billion worth of contracts for local entrepreneurs and created about 70,000 jobs, which sounds like a big number, but honestly, it's just a little drop in the bucket when you take a look at the bigger picture. It's still not nearly enough. So what we began to do is try to focus on changing attitudes amongst the aid agencies, amongst the economists, and tried to, I would argue successfully, got them to realize that small and medium-sized enterprises, social enterprises, local entrepreneurs are one of your most powerful tools when it comes to peace building, and they need to be a part of this process. And at this time, this is about 10 years ago, there was very little talk about that. It was mostly talk about micro-entrepreneurs. There was lots of microfinance, but we were saying, the real job creators are just one tier above that, and they're completely left out of the equation. They're the missing middle, as some people describe it. We were successful in that way of getting to change the attitudes and getting many organizations to begin to invest in them. And we then began to evolve ourselves to try other things. So we began to move into finance, connecting local entrepreneurs to find credit so that they could work on bigger contracts. And then this remarkable thing happened where we began getting approached by hedge funds, these horrible, greedy, capitalist investors in places like Wall Street and London who wanted a piece of our action. And the reason is that they know that some of the fastest growing markets in the world are countries like Burma in Nigeria, and they know that the fastest growing sectors are the small and medium-sized enterprises. And the same thing's going to happen in Colombia. Now that you have peace, the investors are going to start coming back, the mining companies are going to return, you're going to start seeing more investment, it's going to move out, and all of these hedge funds are going to want to try to find a way back into the country, or a way to invest in the country. And so we began to partner with some of them, we began to sell them our data, and now we're focusing much more on how do we get large investors to come into countries like Colombia and support the local private sector. Very quickly, just to explain how Building Markets does this, it's very, very simple. We find local businesses, we verify them. I talked about walking down the streets of Afghanistan as an example of that. We build them up with some training and mentoring, but for the most part, whether it's in Cartagena or in Kandahar, local entrepreneurs are already very capable and have a huge amount of capacity. What they don't know is how to bid on a large international contract or how to understand some of the rules of legal rules and what have you. Then we connect these entrepreneurs to buyers, we connect them to finance, we connect them to investors. And it hasn't always been successful. We've had countries like in Haiti where we had a lot of problems and the programs didn't absolutely work. And then other countries it worked so well that we ended up leaving early and left and handed over our activities to the local organizations. So that's the story of Building Markets. I could get into a long conversation about whether or not a for-profit or a non-profit social enterprise is the best model. But I was actually given a series of questions by Andy that they wanted me to specifically answer for you. So I'm going to go through those quickly now. The first is, what was the relationship between economic growth and peacekeeping? So myself and my team, we've now had experience in about 15 different conflict and post-conflict zones, and we've seen a great deal of similarity. There is a regular phrase that we hear in these circles that every economy is different, every economy is sui generis, and it's true. You know, the challenges that a Colombian entrepreneur is going to face are going to be very different than some of the challenges an entrepreneur in Iraq is going to face. But beneath that, though, there are some tremendous similarities. And so one of those similarities is the relationship between economic growth and peacekeeping, which is that it's a direct relationship. Economic growth is directly correlated with peace and stability. Just the simple act of stopping fighting is going to lead to a dramatic increase in business, even if nobody does anything else. That alone is powerful. The next question I was asked was, how should the international cooperation community change to be more effective? And I would argue that there needs to be more of this. I'd like to congratulate, I think USAID was one of the supporters of this program. Is that correct? Yes?
Supports us, but
not this one? Okay, we'll see. So, well, damn it, USAID, where are you? They should be here. This is something that they did not support 10 years ago, and they need to be here because the people in this room, the social enterprises that I was looking at earlier, they're all having an immediate and dramatic impact on poverty reduction, economic growth, and the growth of civil society. And I can say as a former development worker myself that growth is much more obvious and there's a much clearer relationship than a lot of the programming that we would do with aid money. I was asked what are the key actions that maybe Colombia should take into account as they go forward right now. I think there's two that I would raise. One is beware of unintended consequences. Post-conflict situations are very, very fragile and very, very dynamic. And little mistakes can become very big mistakes very quickly. I'll give you a couple of examples. In Sierra Leone, after the fighting stopped, the United Nations came in and they were flying in all of their food from Europe. Very, very expensive. And then one of the local, or one of the UN staff discovered that they could actually buy eggs very good high-quality eggs in Sierra Leone. So they decided we're going to help the Sierra Leone farmers by buying our eggs here. Within 2 weeks, they had bought up all of the eggs in the country, and they had created horrible inflation, and they had created a black market in eggs, and they'd actually made the situation much, much worse. Something similar happened in Liberia when the United Nations came in and they decided to help the local entrepreneurs by having all of their furniture sourced local. So they set up a relationship between their contractors and local Liberian wood suppliers. And again, that worked really well, but it turned out that the Liberians were using rare wood and were deforesting important and delicate parts of Liberia. So these are examples of some of the unintended consequences that helping the local private sector can have. The second is regarding demobilization, or DDR, as it's often called in the aid business. This idea that you can take former guerrillas and former soldiers and you can put them through 8 weeks of training and give them some tools and suddenly they're a carpenter or they're an entrepreneur. That almost never works. In fact, when I was preparing for this speech, I was trying to think of an example of a country I've been in where that worked. And I know there are some success stories, but honestly, the failures far outnumber the successes because entrepreneurs, it takes a very special character to be an entrepreneur. You can't be trained to be one. And at least I would argue you can't be trained to be one. So that was the second lesson I would suggest in the Colombian experience, that you should trust the market forces and trust the economy to create the businesses and not try to turn people into businessmen on your own. The last question I was asked is, do you have any special advice for the Colombian private sector? And yes, I do, which is don't wait to be invited. There are going to be a lot of international aid agencies and a lot of charities that are going to be arriving in Colombia in the next weeks and months. Many that are already here, and they're going to start bringing in more and more money, and they're going to design these huge programs to fight poverty and to bring the rural economy into the national economy and the national economy into the global economy. And they're rarely going to think to invite entrepreneurs to that conversation, which is ridiculous because it's entrepreneurs who are part of every stage of that process, and it's entrepreneurs who understand how do you connect one part of the economy or one sector to the other. So don't wait to be invited, just show up. Start your own organizations, work with organizations like Andy to find a way to make a difference on your own. Don't wait to be asked. And now lastly, I wanted to tell you 3 things that I've learned as a social entrepreneur over the last 10 years. The first is, and this isn't a surprise based on everything else I've just said, is that poverty is only beaten by small entrepreneurs. You know, we are living in an amazing time. I said earlier that it's remarkable here in Colombia right now because we finally have a peace deal after 50 years. It's also remarkable globally when you take a look at the larger trends. We have seen a greater reduction in poverty around the world, both in absolute and relative terms, than at any other point in history. We actually may see, those of us in this room right now, an end to extreme poverty, not just in our lifetime, but possibly in the next 20 years. And that didn't happen because of charity. It didn't happen because of the United Nations. It didn't happen because of log frame planning. It happened because of trade, of small entrepreneurs being able to work in a more stable environment and turn their little micro enterprise into a small enterprise. It happened because we saw a liberalization of the economy in places like India. It happened because Apple began to move their supply chains into China. This is why we've seen an end to extreme poverty. It's because of the role of entrepreneurs. And in fact, over the last decade, the World Bank has shown that 86% of all the jobs created globally over the last 10 years were created by entrepreneurs. The second thing I've learned is that the easiest and most powerful way to help entrepreneurs in a post-conflict economy, the low-hanging fruit, as we would say, is simply just to connect entrepreneurs to opportunity. In some cases, it might be helping a small business get into a business directory, or helping them get online, or helping a large business find new ways to localize their supply chain, like getting a mining company to start buying its water locally as opposed to flying it in. And finally, the third thing is that there is far more money in the world that can be used to fight poverty sitting in Wall Street than there is sitting in all the charities and all the USAID budgets around the world. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact number, but there's about $150 billion a year, I believe, that's spent on development and charity, and I suspect that Colombia gets a very, very, very small fraction of that. But there is over $1 trillion in the banks in New York and in London that are trying to find their way into frontier economies, into emerging markets like Colombia, that are trying to find their way into small, medium-sized sectors. And if you can find a way to attract those investors in, it will be far more money and far more powerful in fighting poverty than it is if you try to find a way to bring in another charity or another NGO or another aid agency. So that's my story. That's the building market story. There's some controversial things that I've said that I'm sure many of you disagree with. And so we have time for questions, or we have time for you to stand up and say, "You're a fool, go back to Canada." So please. Who would like to go first with a question? This is excellent. I'm glad. No questions. Oh, sadly, this is the one. Do we have a mic?
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Aníbal Torres, director Fundación Lazos de Honor de Soldados. Hoy, gracias a la ANDI, Ministerio de Defensa, Bienestar Sectorial, recibimos el premio por emprendimiento. Y quisiera hacer una pregunta el día de hoy. De todo lo que hiciste, ¿qué harías o qué hubieras hecho para no lograr lo que lograste?
Andrew, can you translate that for me?
Sí, o sea, de todo lo que hiciste,
Okay, like, perdón por mi inglés. So from all of the things that you've done, like in your career, what do you think would be the thing that you wouldn't have done to not to succeed?
Yeah.
That will make you
Yeah.
not
The
succeed
translation.
in what you have done so far.
Yes, that's a very, very good question. Yeah. Okay. Our translator's going back. This is a very sincere and true thing I'm going to say, which is I give a lot of speeches and have for years. That is the single best question I have ever received. Or at least the question Andrea asked me was excellent. One of the things I have learned is that to be a successful entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, requires more than capital and more than hard work and more than a good idea. It requires luck, lots of luck. Being in the right room at the right time, meeting the right person. And so when I look back at all of the mistakes I made, and there were a lot of them, one of the most frequent mistakes is just not showing up. Not going to a conference because I'm just too tired, or I went to a conference last week. Deciding not to go meet with a donor because I've already met with him 3 times and there's no luck, there's no chance that he's going to help this time. And I realize now that you need to show up at a lot of these things. And I would also just add one more thing, which is our organization, Building Markets, began to do something annually called a failure report, where we would ask ourselves this question: what were the mistakes we made this year? What should we have done differently? And we would actually publish this. We would give it to all of our donors, and it was very interesting. Our donors that were in the aid agencies were horrified that we were saying, yes, you gave us $1 million to do this thing in Haiti, and we screwed up this, and this. But our donors who were philanthropists in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco, they loved it because they understood, because in Silicon Valley they understood that success only comes from failure. You have to understand your mistakes and try again and again. So long answer to a very short, good question.
Mira, una pregunta más. Dentro de lo que hiciste, ¿eres consciente de que pronto hiciste acción con daño, tratando de hacer algo bien? ¿Hiciste un daño tratando de hacerlo? Cuando se intenta hacer emprendimiento, tratando de hacer lo mejor posible, se hace daño.
Yes.
Lo determinamos como acción con daño.
Yes. Sí.
¿Qué harías y qué mejorarías para tener un emprendimiento exitoso?
I have seen so many times where this has happened. Mining companies who tried to invest locally and created more damage than good. Social entrepreneurs, even some of our programs where we thought we were helping, but we were hurting. So what would you do to change that? I would say it requires two things. It requires self-awareness. It's very easy as an entrepreneur and as a social entrepreneur to believe your own publicity. In North America right now, there's a cult of the social entrepreneur. There's these conferences and awards and magazines about how social entrepreneurs are changing the world. And we would win these prizes every year and stand on stage and people would clap and get teary-eyed at the miracles we were producing. And we would believe it, which is wrong. We're just normal people who are trying to do a good thing, and occasionally those good things go badly, and so you need to be aware of that and pay attention to that. The second thing I would say is that you need to partner with organizations who are more sensitive to these issues. So if you're opening up a small business or expanding your business into a rural community, make sure that there's people in that rural community that you're talking to who are part of your activity, or an indigenous community who you are respecting and asking questions, because you may think you're helping, but it may turn out you're not. So by partnering with other organizations, you'll be much more sensitive to the problem. Okay?
Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Okay. Oh, one question.
Hi. Everything that you mentioned sounds so intuitive, or at least I believe so. If you were to give one advice to us that is completely counterintuitive from your experience, what would that be?
To us, meaning social entrepreneurs.
Us, the people in this room, us social entrepreneurs, or
Right.
us people who work with social entrepreneurs?
Yeah. I'm looking at this room, and it's a relatively young crowd. Yeah? Yeah. No, it is. It is a relatively young crowd. Social entrepreneurs and people who are interested in this business are a relatively young crowd. If I was attending a conference in Washington right now, hosted by USAID, dealing with some of these issues, it would be a much older crowd. And so the advice I would give to you as younger people who are working on these issues is fail. Try things that you aren't sure are going to work, because you've got lots of time to try again. Try a business that you love, but you're not sure if it's going to make money, because if it doesn't make money, you're young, you can try again. I often tell people, and maybe it applies to this room, move to a place and see if you can do good there or start a business there. And if you don't, well, you're young, you can try again. So that's my counterintuitive advice. Go out and try to fail. You'll learn more, and you've got lots of time. I'm out of time. Thank you so much for inviting me to Bogota and being able to speak with you. I'm going to be in the back for 10 or 15 minutes if anybody else wants to talk to me in person. And once again, congratulations on your peace deal. Thank you. Thank you.